All right, rules and regulations. Are those good things or bad things? Depends on the rule, depends on the situation. We tend to like rules when they apply to other people and they favor us. We're not so crazy if they apply to us and somehow limit our choices. All it takes is one person to do something stupid and someone says there ought to be a law against that, and every year we add 40,000 new laws to the books, and seldom do we take them away. Right? So we know about laws. Some rules and laws are better than others, right? There's some rules that just beg to be broken. There were rules that allowed for slavery, rules that allowed for discrimination, and people rightly said, it's okay to break those laws. We need to break those laws. The other night, Diane and I went and saw Hidden Figures. Anyone seen Hidden Figures yet? The movie out there? I mean, wow, powerful movie. I was so oblivious when I was growing up to the racism that was all around us in our country. It was part of life. It was the rule of the land. Had been part of our system. How do you know when a rule is okay to be broken? When should a rule be broken? That's a question I want us to wrestle with a little bit this morning. Rules are at their best when they serve a purpose, right? When they protect or promote something. But when the focus is no longer on what it was meant to protect and it becomes the thing instead of protecting the thing, that's when the rules get into trouble. But some people like to think about the Bible as a rule book, do's and don'ts to determine rewards and punishments, and whether you get into heaven or not. If I thought that was true, I'd be the first one out of here. I just don't have time for it. The Bible is so much more, and when it gets reduced down to a rule book, it takes all the complexity and all the beauty of this book, and it's not what it was designed to do at all. It's so much more than that. In our scripture reading today, Jesus is going to be intentionally breaking the rules. He knew exactly what he was doing and intentionally breaks rules. Rules that have been observed for centuries, rules that have been given by God to the people of God to structure their life, and Jesus says, I'm going to break that rule. This is why he was seen as a threat. It's not a big surprise that people were trying to get rid of Jesus because he threatened things that they held dear. Now, we all know that we need rules in our lives. Without rules, we have chaos. We've got anarchy. We've seen it again. You can't get rid of a dictator if you have no one to put in its place. You'll just have chaos and things. You can't expect freedom to blossom automatically if there's not something in place. You're going to take the place of a dictator, right? So in order to help us understand today's reading, we're going to have to go back and talk a little bit about this whole idea of the rule that Jesus broke, and it was all about Sabbath. Now, Sabbath goes back to the very beginning, back to Genesis, right? Now, in Genesis, there were not a lot of rules. There were no scriptures. There was no organized religion. There were no pastors. There were no synagogues or temples. There simply was one commandment. God said, be fruitful and multiply. He says, other than that, do whatever you want, right? He says there was not a big list of rules to do. Only one thing you could not do. Don't eat from the tree in the middle of the garden. Other than that, this is your world. Enjoy it. Temptations proved too hard to resist. Adam and Eve were not content to be the creatures they wanted to be like God. And literally all hell breaks loose, right? With that sin enters into the world, and that changes everything. All right, so fast forward. So Sabbath was created to say the pattern that God had created with them, to say God created everything in 6 days, and on the seventh day, God rested. So this is a rhythm that God used. It's a good rhythm for our lives as well. So it's going to go back. People are going to look back to creation and say, this is a model for us. I'm going to fast forward to, so if you're on our timeline, we're going from creation, we're going to zip all the way up here to Moses. All right, so big chunk of time here. Children of Abraham are now slaves in Egypt. All they did was work. They had no weekends. They had no holidays. Their slave masters were there to tell them when to get up, when to go to sleep, when to eat, when to work. It was not an exercise in free will for them. They'd been slaves for generations, almost 400 years of being slaves. And then they cry out, and God eventually sends Moses. And Moses leads them out into the promised land. But now what? What would they do now? How were they going to live? So God gives them a code, right? A code to live by, a gift for them. Commandments to structure their lives. It was a gift for them, for their health, for their wellness. Tell them, how do you love God? How do you love one another? How do you care for the earth? How do you be a good steward of what God has given you? All these things were laid out in this gift that he says to help them structure their life for people who had now no practice at structuring life. Gives them a guide. And one of the foundational pieces of this was that of Sabbath. Right? Remember the Sabbath day, keep it holy. It's one of the big 10. Life is more than work, work, work. Right? When the Egyptians were Lord, okay, that was okay. They said work, you had to work. But God says, now I am the Lord. And when I say we don't work all the time, there's a time to work, there's a time to rest. And that rest day was called the Sabbath. Every seventh day, opportunity to worship, to regain perspective on life. When we slow down enough, we can remember what life is supposed to be about. The Sabbath was designed to give people life. Give life to the people, to the land, to the animals, to the slaves. But like all good things, sometimes something good can be twisted into something else. Today we're going to hear about a group of people called the Pharisees. All right? Now, if you remember, they emerged out of the exile. So when the people lost everything, our timeline again, you see this big break here. If things are going along here, all of a sudden we got nothing because the kingdom was destroyed. They were carried off into exile. When they're away from everything, when they've lost everything, all of a sudden they say, wait a second, how did this happen to us? How did we lose everything important to us? And so they had said, we forgot the law. Moses gave us this gift. He gave us the gift of the law, and we abandoned it. We forgot. We weren't following the things that God told us to do. We get the chance to start over again, and we're not going to make the same mistake again. We are going to dedicate our lives to following the rules, right down to the letter, because that's what faithfulness means. Now, during the time... we're at the time of Jesus' way up here, so there's still a chunk of time in here. And there was a time in here where the Persians were in control, the Greeks in control, the Romans were in control. When the Greeks were in control, they were vicious. They were terrible. They knew that if the people followed the laws of God, if they followed the Sabbath, that would be giving them life and giving them energy. So the Greeks said, you cannot observe the Sabbath. We prohibit you from resting on the seventh day, from worshiping, from doing those kinds of things. This is this time in between the New Testament and the Old Testament. They knew how powerful a Sabbath could be. So the people dedicated themselves. When the Greek rule was thrown off, they were radical about the Sabbath, about keeping this, because no one's going to tell us we can't do this. Sabbath was a big deal. All right, let's go to our story from Luke. One Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields. His disciples plucked some heads of grain and rubbed them in their hands and ate them. But some of the Pharisees said, why are you doing what's not lawful on the Sabbath? Jesus answered, have you not read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? He entered the house of God. He took and ate bread of the presence, which is not lawful for any but priests to eat, and he gave it to his companions. And then he said to them, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. On another Sabbath, he entered the synagogue, and he taught. And there was a man whose right hand was withered. And the scribes and the Pharisees watched him to see whether he would cure on the Sabbath, so they might find an accusation against him. Even though he knew what they were thinking, he said to the man who had the withered hand, come, stand here. And he got up and he stood. And Jesus said to them, the Pharisees, I ask you, is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath, to save life or to destroy it. And after looking at all of them, he said to the man, stretch out your hand, and he did, and his hand was restored. But the Pharisees were filled with fury and discussed with one another what they might do to Jesus. All right, so let's talk about this a little bit. What do we make of this? The laws where you can't labor, the one way of protecting the Sabbath was you can't labor. So to grab a hand of wheat and husk it would be considered work, or to heal someone was considered work. And Jesus says, I know that's what the law says, but what does the law mean? What is the purpose of this law? So Jesus breaks the law. Now, does this give us permission to break laws we don't like? And that's what the Pharisees were worried about. It's a slippery slope. If you say, okay, the rules don't apply to me, I'm an exception to the rule, that's a slippery slope of what doesn't apply to you anymore. Strict adherence to the laws gives us order, gives us control, gives us predictability, but it doesn't allow for creativity or for fresh ideas. And Jesus came announcing that God was doing something new. God was doing something creative. The rules were gifts. They pointed back to this living, dynamic relationship between God and us. But when the rules quit doing what they were intended to do, instead of protecting the thing, they become the thing itself. It's time to let go. Jesus challenges them. Remember what the law was intended to do. Was it to give life or to take life? We don't serve the law. We serve God. Is a rule building relationships, or is it tearing it down? As a principle, human need is going to override legalism. Right? We're called sometimes to do the right thing. But Jesus is really pushing it here, right? The disciples weren't starving. One handful of wheat was not going to take care of their hunger. The guy who had the crippled hand, it wouldn't hurt him to wait 24 hours. He'd been that way for a long time. It wouldn't have hurt him 24 hours to wait till the Sabbath was over. But the point Jesus was making was exactly that. He is Lord of the Sabbath and of everything else. There's a new way of thinking about life. To keep the Sabbath in the best sense is to exercise trust, right? They'd say, I trust that if I don't do this today, if I don't work today, I will still have enough for my family, that God will somehow provide for me. They would do the same thing. Every 7th year, they'd have a Sabbath year where they would say, I'm not going to plant crops in this field this year. I'm going to let it rest. So next year it can be more productive. I'm trusting God. Well, the other fields that are still in production will give me more, so I will be able to let this one lie fallow. Sabbath is an exercise in trust that our worth, our meaning doesn't come from doing more. Jesus is saying it's not enough just to follow the rules. You need to follow me. Now, I think Sabbath is not just a command from God. I think it's a great idea. Look at our culture. We've gone so far the other direction that Sabbath really doesn't mean anything. And we don't really have Sabbath. We have weekends, right? Weekends are filled with all kinds of stuff. Good things. Soccer and dance and projects and shopping. And often we try to squeeze so much in the weekend we end up feeling exhausted instead of refreshed. The question I want us to think about, if Jesus came back today, what might he say about how we use our time that is free? How do we keep Sabbath? How are our minds refreshed and renewed in mind and body and spirit? How does this become a gift for us? Next week we're going to gather for our annual party, our annual meeting, and we're going to talk about all kinds of things that we've done and all kinds of things that we hope to do. Good, important things, as long as we remember why it is that we're doing them, right? If it becomes about us, about how it makes us feel, how it makes us look, we lose perspective. We're no different than the Pharisees. We're doing maybe the right thing for the wrong reasons. Part of gathering is to pause, to give us a time to just gather together, to remember that all that we have is a gift from God, to be used for the glory of God, that we are the hands and feet of God in a hurting world. Then we are following, when we do that, we're following then this way of Jesus. That may take us into some uncharted waters, right? A journey of which we cannot yet see the end. But it brings us to a place where change can happen, where we can be creative, where sometimes rules get broken. I mean, if you're not a little freaked out by this, you're not paying attention. If you want to read the rest of this chapter, Luke chapter 6, when we actually see what Jesus says, we say, whoa, I see why they wanted to kill him. Look at what he was saying to people. So read. We skip over that because our assigned reading for next week skips over everything Jesus says and just goes on to another miracle. So your homework is go back and read the rest of Luke chapter 6. Right? What does Jesus actually say in between the miracles that he's doing? What is it that the miracles themselves point to something else? So read chapter 6 of Luke. What is Jesus saying? The good news in this is that we don't go alone. And that's what makes the encouragement we have as we gather as a people of God, that we're not just individuals trying to do this. We have each other. We've got brothers and sisters to walk with. We have a God who's promised to never leave us or forsake us, no matter where the journey leads. All right, well, we're going to sing a song. It's called The Canticle of the Turning, and it really puts to music sort of this radical message of Jesus that was first expressed by Mary in the words of the Magnificat. I'm going to play along on this. It's an Irish jig. All right, so you may even want to feel like dancing a little bit. I wish we had There's anyone who plays fiddle in this congregation? We really need a fiddle player occasionally to do this. And if you want to sing it with a slight little brogue, that might help as well. As we have this wonderful gift from the people of Ireland, Canticle of the Turning.